Riley, how was the first day of school?
Fine, I guess.
Did you guys pick up on that?
Sure did.
Something's wrong.
Signal the husband.
Uh-oh, she's looking at us. What did she say?
Oh, sorry, sir. No one was listening.
Is it garbage night? We left the toilet seat up. What is it, woman? What?
I'm joy. This is sadness. That's anger.
What?
This is disgust. And that's fear. We're Riley's emotions. These are Riley's memories. They're mostly happy, you'll notice, not to brag.
I wanted to maybe hold one.
What happened? Sadness?
She did something to the memory.
Is everything okay?
I don't know.
Take it back, Joey.
Trying.
Joy, no,
Let
wait.
go.
The core memories.
Can I say that curse word now?
What do we do now?
Nothing's working. Why isn't it working?
We have a major problem.
Oh, I wish Joy was here.
We can fix this. We just have to get back to headquarters.
That's long-term memory. You could get lost in there.
Think positive.
Okay. I'm positive you will get lost in there.
What was that? Was it a bear?
There are no bears in San Francisco.
I saw a really hairy guy. He looked like a bear.
This place is huge. Imagination Land? No way. Dream Productions? Rainbow Unicorn. She's right there. I loved you in Fairy Dream Adventure Part 7. Okay, bye. I love you. You can't focus on what's going wrong. There's always a way to turn things around. It's Broccoli.
Congratulations, San Francisco. You've ruined pizza.
Who's the birthday girl? Brain freeze!
Hang on. Riley, here we come.
Hi there everyone and welcome to the Philosophy Film Club. Today's film we're going to do is Inside Out, a Pixar production. Today's guest is Juan Galt, coming all the way from Mexico today, and he's involved with a project called Disrupt Tech Media. This is a website that can be found at disrupttech.info. That's disruptek.info. We'll probably put links in the show notes and also on the screen if you're watching this on YouTube. This is a project that Juan has only just recently embarked on, and it sort of looks at technology, essentially that future technologies, current technologies, or imagined technologies, etc. And I'm going to kind of let Juan tell me more about it because I'm not that au fait with it, but. Hey Juan, thanks for joining the call, and tell us a little bit about yourself and your project.
Sure, thank you for having me, Patrick. So Disruptive Media is meant to be a media organization that covers all topics that are changing the world as we know it today, that are changing our perception of the norm and that which has been. So things like Bitcoin, things like 3D printing, biohacking, psychology, philosophy, anything that fundamentally challenges the way that we think things should be is fair game for me. And so it's meant to be a very broad spectrum. The majority of the content so far is Bitcoin related because that's my media background. But the idea is to talk about technologies that are disrupting the world as we know it.
Okay, thanks Juan for that. Very interesting project, and I hope listeners might be interested in that. They might take a gander and have a look at your projects. Anyway, let's crack on with the film. Today's film, as I've already said, is Inside Out. Inside Out is a recent Walt Disney production written and animated by the famous Pixar studio, which was released earlier this year, I believe in February or such time, of which the voiceover cast are mostly newcomers, interestingly, or fairly unknown by movie standards, but all of whom still managed to capture brilliantly the characters they portray. The movie starts off with the birth of our main character, Riley, voiceover done by Caitlin Diaz, whom we are introduced by her first emotion, Joy, who's played by Amy Poehler. Joy's main job is to keep Riley happy, something she puts an enormous amount of effort into. Joy introduces us to all of Riley's other emotions. Firstly, we have Fear, played by Bill Hader, whose job it is to keep Riley safe from harm. Then we have Disgust, acted by Mindy Kaling, of US version of The Office fame, interestingly, whose job it is to inspect all bad smells, personal hygiene, and generally keep Riley in good social standing. Next we have Anger, played by Lewis Black. Anger's job is to keep things fair, or at least fair from Riley's perspective. Finally, we have Sadness, played by actress Phyllis Smith. The character, interestingly, Joy doesn't have much to say about in her introduction, but with which she becomes inextricably linked to throughout the movie. Joy then proceeds to explain Headquarters, which is the central living and working space of all five emotions. Riley comes from the Midwestern state of Minnesota, but is seemingly uprooted from her life there to start a new one in the busy and chaotic San Francisco. We later find out that her father, played by Carl McLachlan, is starting a new job. Riley needs her emotions to guide her through her new school, new people, and new life. But an accident involving her core memories changes her entire outlook. Both Joy and Sadness need to find these core memories and return them to Headquarters before it's too late. Inside Out is an interesting portrayal of how the emotions, when faced with sudden changes in Riley's life, or Riley upsets their rhythm, they try to control the situation too much, which creates more confusion for Riley. Their adventures, in an attempt to restore normalcy, is what forms the crux of this movie. I really enjoyed this movie. I thought it was fun to watch. I've always enjoyed Pixar movies. I think they're great. They're brilliantly animated. The music's great. The whole way that Pixar approaches modern cartoons, animations, whatever you want to call them these days, but they do it as brilliantly as they've always done it. I have some criticisms about the story, and I'm sure we'll go and discuss that. But I did like to say I think it is definitely a movie worth watching. It's fun to watch, if anything, and from what I gather, most children enjoyed it as well. Juan, I was curious really to pick your brains, because obviously you introduced this film to me, you wanted to talk about it, etc. And I was curious, what was the main thing for you that drew you to this film, or at least drew you to want to talk about it, let's say?
Yeah, so the reason I was attracted to this film is, it's obviously a very introspective film. They talk a lot about the inner workings of the mind and of motivations, and I studied psychology independently for about 7 years, and I actually studied social work at a former college and all that. So I've always been interested in these topics. But as soon as I saw the trailer, immediately I thought of IFS, which is internal family systems therapy. Is a theory of psychological motivation within humans that says that there's actual multiple sort of entities within ourselves that have their own agendas, their own drives, their own beliefs, and that it is the consensus and the disagreements and the conflict and the kind of human-like relationship that these parts have that actually kind of influences our behavior. And those have inner ecosystems, and then so it's fractal and infinite. And then the individuals at a human sort of physical level influence the family system, and that is its own sort of, it serves the same rules, and then families within society have the same rules, and it goes up from there. But this movie really talked about something that I haven't really heard discussed in a mainstream setting or stage anywhere that I can remember. I'm sure maybe it has, but it seems very deep. And Pixar did a just lovely and amazing job at telling this story, and I very, very much enjoyed it. I think they did a great job. So I thought it was a fantastic movie for the Philosophy Film Club, the audience that you have, and also for maybe the IFS community and anybody that's interested in this kinds of philosophical topics and psychological topics.
Right. Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the word there, ecosystem. I just wanted to clear that up. That's a system where there's almost like an ecosystem, but it's different parts to a person's personality like fear, anger, disgust, joy, that sadness, that which obviously portrayed in the movie. That's assuming that's what you're talking about in that regard, yeah.
Well, the Freedom in Radio community knows it as the ecosystem, and I think the people that have gone deep enough have maybe seen Richard Schwartz's work and interview with Stephen Molyneux and read his book, potentially. And the ecosystem is Stephen Molyneux's adaptation of IFS in his own sort of way of looking at the world, which is very similar. It's just a little bit maybe less structured, but it's basically the idea that there's different parts with different roles, and that we need to kind of open communication and listen to all parts of ourselves in order to have a full and robust personality, and to essentially sort of gain self-knowledge by listening to all of our parts. Doesn't mean we have to agree with them, doesn't mean we have to let them take mastery over our body and consciousness, but rather listen, and ultimately there's a kind of seat of sort of choice that we do have, a capacity of choice, that if we have the best information we can make the best choices, is kind of the idea. That's very much what this movie is about.
Yeah, no, thanks for that explanation. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting how this movie, because you talk about the internal family systems, and we had like the various islands in the movie. You kind of see this towards the beginning of the movie, where they talk about Honesty Island, Family Island, and Goofy Island, I think, and various others, Friendship Island and stuff like that. And these are kind of core parts of her personality, I guess. I think they're slightly different to the Miko system, or in the terms of the IFS, but I thought it was very interesting that the IFS part sort of linked to at least some of these core parts of these islands. You know, what do you think what was your relationship with those islands in relationship to this idea within internal family systems?
Yeah, I found the islands fascinating in a variety of ways. When they portray Riley's inner world, it is very much looks like a city, right? There's a sort of headquarters, sort of tower at the middle, and it is sort of stemming from the pit of forgotten memories, pretty much. And there's bridges to the islands, and the islands sort of are born out of the memories, but are also interacting with the hard storage memories. And then the meaning of the islands is directly tied to Riley's environment. The moment that her environment changes and they move to Philadelphia and they leave Minnesota behind, well, that's when the struggle begins, and that's when the old islands start to crumble and new islands at the end of the movie arise. And so this really suggests a very, very sort of crucial tie between personality and environment. And I thought that was interesting. I mean, I think you could argue there's a line between how much of her personality is her environment and how much is her own inner ecosystem, and that could be her own side of her personality could be embodied by her parts: fear, anger, disgust, and sort of how they seem to look at the world, right? But the idea is that there's a very deep connection there, and I think that makes perfect sense to me. I think from an epistemological level, we are matter interacting with matter after all, and we don't have to go too deep into philosophy, but I think that makes sense, and that was very interesting too.
Yeah. Also, the interesting part with that was when obviously her environment changed quite dramatically when she went to San Francisco. It was at that point that those islands at least started to crumble. Now, I know there were other things partly to do with that, but going back to your point initially about environment being a part of her internal system as well, it was a very, I think it was nicely segues quite well, I think. I wanted to discuss the characters because they're all kind of interesting. We obviously hear a lot about Joy, and I think we could talk for quite some time about Joy, which we will do. But I wanted to sort of talk a little bit about, or at least ask your opinion, see what you thought about the other characters in there. I mean, we had, I think it was Disgust, and Disgust is displayed in the colour green, which is rather interesting, of course. Yes, being a sort of icky colour. I was curious, how did you find those characters and how they related in this film?
Well, it's interesting that all humans, as we are introduced to within the movie, have the same 5 core emotions, which are fear, sadness, disgust, joy, and anger. And they all generally have their own sort of roles, and they tend to serve the same purposes within everybody's ecosystem. So that was an interesting sort of parallel, and I think it draws from a lot of psychoanalysis and sort of theory of psychology. And apparently there's a couple of other emotions that were sort of omitted, right? Like surprise and contempt. But you could say that those are embodied within Disgust herself. I like the way that they deal with it. I think that it would have been interesting to focus more on anger and anger's sort of role in the ecosystem. But the main sort of protagonists within the ecosystem of Riley are sadness and joy. And sadness obviously serves a very important purpose that is not really allowed to function until the end of the movie. In fact, the whole movie is about a struggle between all of Riley's parts, primarily happiness and sadness. Sadness, I think, from an IFS perspective, is an exile. She doesn't have a voice. She's not allowed to touch the core memory. She's not allowed to play. She is misunderstood. She is kind of helpless. There's a variety of moments in the movie where happiness is just Joyce trying to really egg up sadness and make her not feel sad, and sadness just feels worse and just literally collapses on the floor face first, and it's like, so sad, right? And just wallowing, right? And there's a sort of, this is where the kind of the conflict comes in, because Joy's primary goal is to keep people happy, and she just seems to have a lot of trouble doing that with sadness. And there's a sort of disconnection there, a miscommunication. There's something missing there, and I think that element that is missing is reflected not just within her own inner world, but within her relationship with her parents as well. And it is very much tied to her relationship with her parents, and the way that her parents deal with sadness as well, and with missing home, and with the difficulties of moving to a new city. It also kind of shows a lack of empathy from the parents to Riley, and from Riley to her own sadness, and that is sort of another crux of the movie, but maybe we can sort of talk about that a little bit later.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it? I mean, the whole business of moving, it was almost like it was a huge surprise to all the emotions, which presumably was a massive surprise to Riley herself. It seems inconceivable that this wasn't discussed with her, but given the surprise, it clearly wasn't, right? And it clearly wasn't. It seemed to be something that came out of the blue. At least that's the way that the film portrayed it. Logic might dictate that wouldn't be necessarily the case, but given that we're watching a movie and we're looking at surprise and we're looking at emotions, I think it kind of I thought it was kind of interesting that there was so much surprise on their part about the moving part, and no wonder there was such a self-managing going on. Like Joy was rushing around trying to have happy thoughts about the whole thing, and we're going to have this, and this house is going to be like this, and this was all discussed with Riley, of course, in the car with her father on the way to San Francisco. This wasn't a discussion that they'd had before. It wasn't a house that she'd visited. They hadn't taken her to that place. So there's a fascinating disconnect from adult to child there, I think.
Yeah, I think that you can probably give them, I give them some creative license, right? They had to pick a problem, and they had to work with a problem to sort of illuminate and have this sort of conversation about the inner world of people. And they chose this problem, which is moving to San Francisco. But yeah, I think that, realistically, she must have had some knowledge about it. I think that the first criticism you would make of how the family dealt with this huge move is that there was clearly very little communication, and there's very little sort of influence that Riley had over this move and over how it would impact her environment and her life as she's known it for 15 years or 12 years, I think it is. And so that's one of the sort of first points of like, ooh, there's something wrong there. There's something that's not working properly in the family there. And this sort of, I think that's one of the failures in communication. This movie very much is about communication, right? A lot of the time, mom doesn't really understand maybe what's happening with Riley. Like, mom sort of knows that Riley's having a hard time and thanks her for being her perfect happy girl or something like that, and Riley's like, okay, well, I guess I gotta be happy because that's what makes mom happy, and that's what makes dad happy. And so she has this managerial sort of role influence from her mother. Her mom sort of gives her praise and approval based on staying happy, and does not particularly welcome or sit down and say, hey, you know what, let's really sort of work through your sadness, let's work through your hard feelings, because there must be feelings there. let's really sort of that doesn't happen in the film until Riley has to sort of until the feelings within Riley, sadness and anger and fear and disgust, just get so polarized and so extreme that she does something rash and basically tries to go on a bus on her, like runs away from home, and at 12, which is sort of tremendous. This is the sort of power of communication and the consequences of lack of communication, and lack of communication results in lack of empathy, I think, to a considerable degree.
I got some thoughts about the other characters as well, but we can talk about that towards the end. But let's perhaps talk more about Joy.
This is Joy. With an unstoppable spirit and unbeatable energy, Joy brings a smile to your face, and who cares? Let's party!
Joy seems to... Obviously, Joy's the main character. She's the narrator. She's almost the CEO of of Riley's mind. She tries to control much of her bad feelings, etc., and all that, which I find quite fascinating. What were your thoughts on... I know you've already sort of discussed some of them, but did you have any deeper, more thoughts about Joy in particular?
Yeah, I think Joy is... I find her fascinating because she's the first emotion that we're introduced to. Riley's born, and we see Joy. And then Joy is sort of her first experience of her mother. Joy is very much like her mother in that they share that same sort of strategy to coping with difficult things. Is, let's be happy, right? Let's try to be happy. Let's look for the positive. Let's be optimistic. Don't dwell on the bad things. Don't sort of think about it too much. Just go and read and distract yourself. And you wonder, like, why is joy the main emotion? Why isn't it sadness or anger or disgust or fear? Why is it joy? And I don't know that anybody can remember this, but the relationship between mom and child is the first thing that any kind of human being will experience inevitably. I mean, you could say that you could go farther back into like the, inception, and that's a connection between the male and the female, but consciousness probably at the level of memory and a visceral experience of the world doesn't happen until like probably way later, until you're onto pregnancy, right? So you could really say that the first experience of existence from the point of view of an individual's mind and consciousness and memory comes from the connection with the mother. And when Riley is born, Joy is born, and Joy is a mirror-like reflection of mom. And mom is happy, and Riley smiles, and that's Joy inside Riley playing, sort of being happy, right? And so I found that a very sort of deep insight, right, into sort of how powerful that bond is, and how deep and how early that bond is, and that strategy that will permeate throughout the movie and be one of the core sort of tensions of the movie. The strategy of staying happy starts there, and its exacerbated sort of extreme is what leads to problems, right? Joy has a fundamental role within the personality, but it can become extreme and controlling to the point where it exiles sadness. And the exile of sadness is what leads to the disassociation that Riley experiences, to the point where there's a moment in the movie where fear, anger, and disgust are at control of Riley's sort of mind, and sadness and joy are off in permanent memory land. They can't really influence the immediate consciousness, and they just... Once they get on the bus and she's on the bus, they can't play with the master console anymore and sort of influence Riley. And they're like, oh my God, we can't make her feel anything. You couldn't have a more explicit expression of disassociation than you can't make her feel anything. And so it really shows sort of the struggles and balance and disbalances between these energies.
Yeah, it sort of showed, obviously... Once joy and sadness have been sucked out to the the long-term memory land.
It's like a city.
City, yeah. And the rest of the emotions were kind of all of a fray, all kind of like lost in space. I mean, I guess they were trying to make her feel joy, and joy seemed to be the linchpin for all of them. Like, she was the major. Like I say, I called her the CEO. She was the one that masterminded everything that went, or at least attempted to mastermind a lot of what Riley was feeling or experiencing. Hence her obsession with trying to put sadness into the sadness circle and keep her from touching the core memories, and they were all kind of lost at sea when she was gone. And of course, all they could do was, either show disgust, anger, or fear when Joy was no longer available in the headquarters. I think my problem with that, I say problem, but just the lack of consistency, because of course emotions, there's no one good or better emotion, but of course these days I guess people would claim that joy was probably the best emotion, because joy is happiness, all the good stuff, feeling good. It doesn't lend itself to unpleasant experiences, let's say, and that's kind of weird, because all our emotions are there is to help guide us, essentially, to give us a guidance. So anger gives us a guide on how we're feeling in a particular interaction or a situation, and it kind of lets us know that we're in a bad situation or we're in a difficult situation, much like fear does, disgust does. I mean, they kind of let us know about the unpleasant things. So this kind of idea that they're neutered without the sort of presence of joy, I found that a little bit too, disrespectful of other emotions, if that makes sense.
I think it's a great example of what happens when polarization happens. And polarization is a concept from IFS, which says that basically whenever an exile, right, a core early childhood intensely sort of memory-based or feeling-based emotion is ignored and rejected and taken away from the awareness and not processed and not sort of integrated and not consciously thought of or dealt with, when it's not safe to have a particular emotion or memory around, and her inner ecosystem and her outer ecosystem sort of enforce that through gifts of praise and lack of empathy, lack of communication, and perhaps even punishment or hostility from her environment. That kind of repression, that kind of ostracism of sadness is what destabilizes the system. I like in this movie that all the emotions are given a valuable role. I do think that they are given respect. Anger is given its respect as trying to defend Riley from injustice. Fear is a protection mechanism. Disgust is a social and nutritional protection mechanism. It's trying to keep you from disgusting sort of icky things that can make you sick. And so I thought that they did give them respect. I think that in that moment where sadness and joy are outside of the helm of control of Riley, and it's sort of fear, anger, and disgust controlling it, I think that is an example of what happens when the internal communications of the system break. And IFS would, I think, look at this as there are three firefighters trying to make the best out of a shitty situation. And that's what happens. And that's the sort of a well-understood place that personalities can sort of come to within the IFS sort of methodology. I mean, we can talk about other things like how they genderified the emotions. Like anger is a boy, and it's like, right? And fear is a boy, and it's like, really scared. And then the girl is disgust, very socially sort of acute, right? And there's interesting sort of things to explore there, and happy to talk about that as well. But
yeah, I was going to say, actually, often the construed negative emotions were portrayed by men. So fear and anger was portrayed as guys, so you had the kind of ridiculous sort of alpha male kind of Mr. Angry guy,
Very nice. Okay, looks like you got this. Very good. Oh, that's sharp turn! Ah, look out!
That's Fear. He's really good at keeping Riley safe.
Easy, huh? Hi, back! Oh, we're good. We're good. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And we're back.
Wait, did he just say we couldn't have dessert?
That's anger. He cares very deeply about things being fair.
So that's how you want to play it, old man? No dessert? Oh, sure. We'll eat our dinner right after you eat this.
And of course, he's the guy that is particularly triggered in the father's emotion when Riley's mother is trying to indicate to the father about something being wrong with Riley, and and he's kind of what is it, woman? That's a kind of classic thing. And then of course fear is this kind of almost like this sort of ridiculous beta male that is constantly treading on eggshells, constantly scared of his own shadow, And these, let's say, they're not unreasonable portrayals of men these days in the media.
No, they're not.
And
yeah,
of course, the female roles being primarily joy and obviously sadness as well, interestingly, are kind of assigned to femininity, I guess.
Yeah.
Although there is obviously a difficult relationship between the pair of them, but I think at the very end it's sort of they both find a certain amount of solace between each other. So there's this, girls hanging out.
Yeah, within her mom's ecosystem, right? It's like a group of girls.
Yeah, but even even within Riley, the sadness and joy, they're able to kind of help each other. Now, of course, there is another female in there, of course, disgust, and I guess, in fairness, that is a intrinsically female thing as well. She's less overt than joy and sadness as female characters, and of course fear and anger as male characters. I certainly had some criticisms about that. I felt it was anger has a very useful role to play, as does fear, of course. Fear has an enormously great role to play in our lives. I mean, you grow up as children, you climb high walls, you fear the height and everything. It makes sense, that you have those kind of regulators. So there is nothing intrinsically negative about those emotions. I think that's where my criticisms of this movie go, is that they kind of eulogize some emotions. The other emotions are only useful insofar as they can be useful to the other emotions. So, for instance, like anger became useful at the very end when disgust was winding him up, so that she could, use him as a welding torch, essentially, to open the glass to let joy and sadness back into the headquarters. And he sort of just took the bait, without any kind of thought at all. It's like, oh, I know how to wind him up and hold him up like a blowtorch, and away he goes. Those kind of things, I think, obviously fear and anger are seen as negative emotions for the most part. And if we go back to the joy thing, and I think this is what I found particularly startling about Joy, and you touched on it earlier about her being the kind of mother character. This was so true. I mean, even from the beginning, like, the cooing when she cooing at Riley while she was a baby, it was so clearly meant to be a mother character. And this was kind of shown throughout the whole film, because she was constantly trying to regulate Riley's experience of the world and all that kind of thing. And this constant need for happiness, this is what made me feel this whole film was generally geared towards parents. The fact that children actually enjoy this is kind of interesting in some ways, in a different way, which I might discuss in a moment. But I just wanted to focus on that particular issue, that it seems to be very, very much parenting orientated, and perhaps very mother orientated, which again perhaps takes us to another cultural meme, that it's generally, perhaps it's more likely mothers taking their children to these movies these days. And so it's kind of almost saying this story is all about how parents feel about child raising. There's this constant managing of their child's feelings, and this constant need to keep them happy. And this was kind of displayed really well in one part of the movie, when the father was, after he sent her to bed, etc., he then goes into the bedroom and he tries to do the goofy noises with her, tries to make her laugh, etc. Of course, all of her core memories are gone by then, so in a sense she didn't really have much access to Goofy Island anymore because of the lack of core memories. At least that's how the film displayed it. But that argument that they'd had prior to that, which had precipitated her going to her room, or being sent to her room, this was sort of like the father didn't want to sort of necessarily talk about that, what had actually happened. He wanted to sort of make this rather goofy sound, hoping that it would just all be happy and it would just all be fun and I wouldn't be asked any difficult questions, etc. And of course she wasn't having it. She just gave him a kind of glary look, and it just seemed to me that was the, that kind of essentially pointed out what this film kind of was essentially directed at parents, oh, you're not so bad, or oh, your lack of communication is not so bad, or your decision to just be goofy when perhaps you should be serious, or you should not so much serious, but you should be more honest about what's going on, or more curious about what's going on. That kind of was encapsulated in that particular scene, but it was kind of something that went throughout the whole movie, and particularly with the character Joy. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I think it's very much a family-oriented movie. I think that it's not just meant for children, and it's not just meant for parents. It's a movie that anybody can watch, and anybody can sort of glean something from. I think maybe what really draw me to this movie, and remembering back now, I think the first comment that I made on Facebook when I posted the trailer was finally a mainstream movie that empathizes with children, like explicitly. And the whole movie is about Riley's inner world and her experience of her life and the changes in her life, and the parents' apathy towards that experience. And I think that portrayal is what communicates to parents, or at least parents are going to have a hard time not becoming aware of that, right? It's like, oh, yeah, there's clearly a problem here, and if I only understood how she's really feeling, then this wouldn't be a problem. It's really kind of talking about the motivations of the child, and yeah, and I think it is a guide for parents, because parents have basically absolute influence over how the children are going to feel. Like if the parents, again, like we go back to the whole setup of the movie, is if the parents had sat down and talked with Riley about the move and really have her work through it and have her expectations of the home, what the home's going to be like and what her new life is going to be like. If she was prepared for that, a lot of this could have been avoided, but it doesn't happen, right? She is imagining a very different house. She's got wild fantasies about what the house is going to be like, and then she gets there and there's like a dead rat and it smells and it's grungy and it's sort of like hidden in like this seeming alleyway street, right? It's portrayed very grimly, very sort of like the colors are pale, it's dark, it's sort of hidden, and it seems like a sort of middle lower class suburb, and it's interesting. I think it does speak to the parents, and in my experience talking to parents that have watched the movie, they very much are curious. I think they really recognize it. At least one of the parents that I've talked to recognizes it as a sort of guide. Like it's really trying to communicate a message about how to parent and how to deal with the child's inner world, and helping them understand the inner world, but also helping the children understand themselves, right? That's I think the other thing that kids might find fascinating is like, oh, that's how I work, interesting, right? And it's a very complex and sophisticated theory of psychology communicated in a very consumable and easy to understand way, which is really where the brilliance of Pixar comes in.
I think that was definitely their intent. I just got the feeling, though, I must admit, watching the movie, that this was more about you work hard, Mum, to try and make your child happy, and they just, sometimes you just can't do it. You can do all the jigs and, make all the jokes and goofy noises you like, but, sometimes that child just ain't happy. And I sort of got the impression it was a little bit sort of, it wasn't really challenging parents. It wasn't really challenging anyone in particular. I wouldn't even necessarily say it was challenging the child either. But it wasn't really challenging anyone. I mean, there was this kind of, once she comes back from having run away and all that kind of thing, suddenly there's this communication that happens. And there's also this connection. Hence, Family Island comes back to life and all that kind of thing. And it didn't really make a lot of sense. She'd essentially stolen money off her parents, disappeared onto a bus, got on that bus, and then got off the bus, of course. And we all understand the cartoon story as to how that happened, but it kind of was like, it was just all kind of rather nice, and the parents understood the child, and the child understood the parents, and with virtually no communication, other than perhaps a few tears and a kind of, I kind of lost myself and whatever, that kind of thing, There wasn't really any particular hard-asked questions asked of the parents, I don't think.
You're right about that. Like, you're right that there wasn't any kind of deep exploration of, okay, how did we get here? Why can't we how can we prevent this in the future? There was no sort of conscious recognition of the parents' sort of mistakes there as far as communication.
No exploration, I guess, would be my take.
Yeah, no conscious exploration. But there was a communication, and the communication was Riley gets there, she expresses her sadness, and the parents are like, she's like, oh, please don't be mad, which kind of suggests like there's been some punishment before for her expressing sadness, which isn't portrayed. And this is a side note. The interesting thing about this movie is that we see like 30 seconds pretty much, or a minute, of Riley's early childhood, and then we jump to 12 years old. Like 5 minutes of it is the introduction, and then Riley's 12. We really skip a lot of sort of experience, and that's, any kind of punishment for sadness is not really portrayed in those 5 minutes.
Of course, you get a sense of the punishment thing which happened when she was sent to a room,
right,
rather than trying to explore. I mean, there is some kind of pretense to exploring what her issues are, but they're more concerned with that she's not happy, and and that seems to be more of a reflection on them. Oh, I'm a parent, my child should be happy, and then there's a lack of curiosity there about why is Riley angry, why is she upset, why is she sad, why is she...
There's a lack of communication about it.
Yeah.
Like, at the dinner table, there's definitely a kind of point where the conflict sort of comes to fruition and energies clash, and then mom's like, something's going on, and dad, it flips out. So there's definitely some of these negative feelings expressed. They're not expressed very well. Right, again, it's sort of a lack of communication. Like, you don't just throw shit. I can't remember what Riley does, but she's like, leave me alone or something, I don't know. And that says that she doesn't know how to express her feelings. And she doesn't know how to understand them to some degree within herself. I just wanted to take it back a little bit about what you said, that there was no communication. I think there was communication. When Riley says, oh, I feel sad because of X, Y, and Z, and please don't get mad, and then dad is like, oh, I miss Minnesota as well. I miss camping, and I miss the hockey, and then mom, I think, says something as well. Oh yeah, I miss it too. And then they hug, and then they cry, and then that's the moment of shared grief, and communicating that grief in the moment. There is expression there. There's no evaluation of past behavior, but there is sort of recognition of the problem and the sadness, and that technically, at least in the movie, reconciles the conflict.
But I would argue that was kind of sentimental stuff. I miss Minnesota, I miss the hockey, I miss all this kind of stuff. I mean, maybe what she's actually saying is, I miss actually you talking honestly with me, openly, about things that might affect my life or affect your life. Like, for instance, her father is like he's got this business he's started. That's why they've moved to San Francisco. And, and there's this thing where Fia comes up and says, oh, dad seems upset and all that kind of thing. Doesn't seem to be a lot of communication about the pressures that he's under with work and stuff like that, with his new business, etc. It's all very much sort of kind of hidden, which is kind of exemplified after the pizza, when sadness touched the core memory, and had a funny memory at that, which was of her father chasing a car down the hill, and it's kind of funny, but it was tinged with sadness. And I think the sadness in that instance, whilst it wasn't particularly connected very well, but I think it had connected with the fact that the reason why she was off buying pizza was to kind of assuage the sadness that she felt about her father having to disappear off to work and stuff like that, and not really being able to connect with her in any honest or meaningful way. And that's why I found that last scene, or not, sorry, it wasn't the last scene, but certainly the scene when she comes back from running away, to be kind of sentimental, to be kind of lacking in any real depth. It didn't really make sense of why she did what she did.
Yeah, there's a missing component of why didn't she just say I feel sad, and then I think that's where there's a sort of lack of memory about her early childhood. The audience doesn't get that. There's only very subtle hints about her fear of expressing her sadness, and the strategy that the family has had from get-go, from the inception of Joy, is just try to keep everybody happy, right? But there's no real methodology. Like, their strategy is just to play games and be goofy and just praise. Oh, you're my happy girl. That's how I like my happy girl. I love my happy girl, right? And Joy says that to Riley, and Mom says that to Riley. This is where I think the core internalization of mom as joy is sort of defined. Is they both talk about Riley as my happy girl at the end. So I think there's a very clear parallel between those two sort of personalities.
It is interesting that Joy is kind of very clearly the mother. There's clearly no father figure in her internal system. I mean, I guess you could argue that maybe it's fear and anger, but even the father portrayed in the film, he's not really fear and anger either. I guess maybe there's partly with fears with his employment. I don't know about anger. I mean, other than the scene where he sends her to bed, there wasn't an awful lot of anger coming from him as a character.
I think there is. I mean, there's a clip that Pixar released afterwards, like a short film to add on to Inside Out, which is about that boy that she meets at the end of the movie, and the boy sort of knocks at the door and is like, "Hey, is Riley home?" Totally sort of just cool, kind of spaced out kid, right? And that is like, oh, like internally, like he's just like from the outside, his eyes are just open, and from the inside, it's like red alert, right? It's like, is that a boy? And then the alarms go off. That's fear. And then the inner parts are like, what do we do, right? Like they're really sort of kind of alarmed by it. So yeah, I think that the male father figure is very much associated with anger and fear, even though there's one moment where dad comes into the room and tries to be goofy, and she kind of says, basically in a look, she kind of says, leave me alone, and then he walks away and says, well, whenever you're ready to talk, I'm happy to talk, pretty much is what he says, and then he walks away.
Yeah.
And I thought that was sort of a very calm and sort of welcoming thing, like that's a good thing to do. Like if she's upset, she's upset.
Oh yeah, I mean, there were moments, I think this is where the whole kind of thing disconnects their characters, because you're right, there were moments of great empathy from them, and there were, but as I say, it was disconnected by these other moments where there was a lack of it. Yeah, sorry, just to go back to that scene, you were talking, was that very much at the very end where they were trying to portray her teenage life in just short, snappy scenes, like at the very as the credits roll?
No, it's actually a separate mini film that Pixar released, and they've been doing that with a lot of films. So it's on YouTube. I don't know if you've seen it.
Oh, I see. Right, okay. I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, it's really funny.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's one thing we haven't talked about, which is the motivation behind mom's sort of strategy of keep happy, at least within the context of the move, is there's a clear sort of anxiety from mom about how much dad can handle, right? How much stress and pressure he can handle, and how much pressure he's under. And one of the things she says when mom goes and talks to Riley right after that, they sort of move in, and Riley's about to blow up with sadness and anger and fear, and then mom says, oh, I'm very grateful that you have been such a happy girl and remain a happy girl, right? And then she cools off and is like, okay, well, let's keep being happy because mom likes happy. And then mom says, yeah, this is, your dad's got new business, and, it'll just make it easier on him for you to be happy right now. So she's like, okay, it's important for me to be happy, or else my dad might freak out. And, that's basically, that brings the money. So it's survival. So it makes it very real and sort of visceral for her, right?
Right.
And that's a very quick, very subtle communication that happens, but it's also kind of explicit, right? So I think it's an interesting moment that really illuminates what's happening for the parents and what's at least mom's justification of that strategy. Again, it's not a very good strategy. I think that's maybe what this movie at least touches on, is that, hey, you know what? You need to have a lot more communication than just staying happy. You can't maintain happiness without accepting sadness. And that is the other thing that we haven't really talked about enough, which is the relationship between sadness and joy, and the crucial importance of sadness in the equilibrium of a person's system. Sadness must be included in the conversation for the ecosystem to not be polarized and hostile or disassociated.
Right.
Which is what happens when sadness and joy are out and about, sort of trying to get back to master control. Riley becomes contemptuous and sort of rash and fearful and just not really thinking clearly and not really understanding her motivations, to the point where she gets disassociated.
Yeah.
So I would like to sort of now take it to talk about sadness and joy, because it is the blend between those emotions that I find also really interesting. It is arguably the main message of this movie is, hey, you know what? You really need to open your heart and minds to your sadness and welcome it and recognize its value in helping you grieve that which cannot happen anymore, that which is lost, and relax and be ready for the new, but you need to accept the sadness.
Yes, I completely agree. I think the poignant point when it becomes useful is when Sadness is consoling Bing Bong after losing his cart, his broomstick cart or whatever it was that he was supposed to be flying Riley to the moon with.
I'm sorry they took your rocket. They took something that you loved. It's gone. Forever.
Sadness. Don't make him feel worse.
Sorry.
It's all I had left of Riley.
I bet you and Riley had great adventures.
Oh, they were wonderful. Once we flew back in time. We had breakfast twice that day.
Sadness.
It sounds amazing. I bet Riley liked it.
Oh, she did. We were best friends.
Yeah, it's sad.
Sometimes things are out of your control which cause you to be sad, and they're as much a helpful part of learning in life and learning how to handle sadness, because sadness is very much a part of life as much as happiness is. That kind of came out in that scene. I think that was very well done.
I think so too, and I think that, it's a beautiful sort of scene, and it made me almost cry. I'm not sure if I cried, but I probably did. You tear up because it's so real. Bing Bong's experience is so real. He's realizing that his dreams of going to the moon with Riley are not going to happen, and that he is kind of obsolete, right? He has run his course. And you also recognize that Joy is incapable of making him feel happy. Like, this is the point where you see most clearly the limitations of this strategy called let's keep everybody happy, and reality sort of sets a boundary and says no.
Right.
Sometimes you need to feel sad. And then sadness comes in and simply listens. And just simply and it's like, yeah, that's sad, and just empathizes and connects with the Bing Bong sadness. And that just blows Joy's mind, completely blows her mind. Because up to this point, Joy has felt very uncomfortable around Sadness's display of sadness, right? She's just always don't do that. Don't think about that. Don't swallow it. It's always rejecting her experience and trying to sort of get her to basically stop being her, which is keeping Sadness from being sad, right? And this is a crucial sort of pivotal moment in the movie. And then later on, when Bing Bong and Joy end up in the pool of where memories are forgotten, right? This is sort of the equivalent of a graveyard of memories, and memories go there, fall, they lose color, which color represents emotion here. They go black, and then they eventually evaporate into the ether as if they were no more. And they're there. Joy and Bing Bong are there, and Joy is basically losing all hope that she can actually make Riley happy again. And now she lets herself feel sadness, because she, of course, has her own ecosystem that is internalized from sadness, right? But that's not really... You don't go into Joy's head then, but you kind of see her emotions expressed in that she actually cries, and then she touches the memory, and the memory becomes a little bit blue. And then she recognizes, oh, people came to help because of sadness. Sadness is essential for bonding in a group.
Yeah, I would agree. That was the scene where she's with she remembers the mother and father consoling her after a hockey match, and which she'd lost, or maybe her favourite hockey team had lost. I can't quite remember now. But yeah, that's how the consoling in sadness was just as important as the let's have a happy jig and whatever, And that was what Joy. She wasn't able to provide that kind of usefulness.
Yeah, and you could go further than that and sort of say, well, if Riley hadn't experienced that sadness, which comes with the recognition that she just did not have the right skill set to win the hockey game, then she wouldn't have recognized that and then over time worked hard enough to actually win the tournament with her team later on. You can draw that from the very sort of subtle storytelling. And this is the moment where the polarization between sadness and joy starts to de-escalate, and it starts to blend together, and then suddenly sadness has a lot more voice, and joy is a lot more welcoming of sadness, and kind of more relaxed. Like, she's less on edge trying to keep everybody happy robotically, right? She's a lot more accepting of sadness. And then there's like an element of male disposability on this one that I just find kind of eerie, right? And very much...
Right.
Because, okay, so we just talked about sadness and the bond. Joy gets on the car rocket thing with Bing Bong singing, Bing Bong, Bing Bong, Bing Bong. Bing Bong jumps off, recognizing that he's too heavy and that he can't help. Joy flies up, right? And then that moment happens, Joy experiences sadness about Bing Bong's sort of sacrifice and loss. She internalizes Bing Bong saying, hey, I will make sure I promise to get Riley to the moon. And then she goes off. But now to get back to the base, she goes to Imagination Land, where there's this machine that is producing ideal teenage boys. Like, it's a mass production machine of ideal teenage boys. And then she just presses a button like 100 times, and they just stack up. And then she's like, do you really love Riley? And they're like, yeah, we love Riley. And they're like, okay, well, come with me. And then so they all kind of stack up through this magic bag. And then she stands on top of like 100 perfect teenage boys and then falls. So she just sort of goes forward so that she can get to the center helm, which is on the middle of the pit of forgottenness, right? So all the boys die. Like, all the boys fall like 200 feet and then fall into the pit of forgottenness. And there's never like, ooh, that sucks, right?
It's not even, I don't think it's even contemplated, no. They're all expendable.
They're super expendable. It's just like, ooh. Yeah. That struck me pretty strongly.
I guess the argument would be that they're make-believe, but you're right. I mean, in some ways, it's sort of it was a very. I must admit, I did think it was a very strange addition to the story. Like, this is the way we're going to get over to the headquarters. I don't know what was the thought that came to the author's mind to think, oh, that would make it an interesting.
Yeah, that sounds like a good idea.
It's like, it was kind of bizarre,
Yeah.
But going back to Bing Bong, I mean, he was interesting. I mean, I actually initially thought you were talking about him being, I don't know why I would consider him to be male, but I kind of do, which is weird,
I kind of do as well, yeah.
I thought you were maybe discussing him with the fact that he jumped off. I think the thing for that, I think the very obvious part of that was the fact that he was a childhood dream. He was like a childhood friend, so of course childhood friends generally, they dissipate in the minds of children as they get older, and of course, Riley was 12 by then, so Bing Bong is not going to be an important factor of her life, like he may have been when she was around 5 or 4 or whatever, And I think that was an interesting. He was in the memory hole. The memory hole always being a place where everything gets lost. All the memories get lost in the memory hole. I don't know what that says particularly about the story. I think he was an interesting character to add to the whole.
Yeah, he was a very interesting character, and I find it really interesting that you point out that he was a boy, because I think that while there were no physiological sort of markers that he was necessarily a boy, there sure as hell wasn't any markers that he was a girl. No. Like, he didn't have long hair, I think. He didn't have like any sort of stereotypical female things.
I guess the voice was male, but
the voice is male. The voice is definitely male. But I think that if you had to make a choice, is it a boy or girl? I think the obvious answer is it's a boy. And again, talking back about sort of gender dynamics and disposability, he is basically the only character in the movie that dies, aside from the other 100 perfect teenage boys.
Right.
And he is self-sacrificial for the betterment of Joy and Riley. And this is, again, tied to our sort of cultural values in general. The male sinks with the ship, and the females and the children sort of float away. And so that's another interesting sort of element. It's subtle, and it's very subtle because it's masked. Like, Bing Bong is not explicitly a boy, but it's more boy than girl, anyways.
Actually, that's kind of interesting because it kind of segue with the whole Bing Bong. In a sense, you could argue to some degree could be the father figure in her life, and which interestingly brings me on to another topic a little bit, because in this particular instance, like imaginary friends, it's not all children that have imaginary friends either, and it's this kind of meme that's the norm, that children have childhood imaginary friends, and that's how it's kind of played out in this film. But that's not strictly true. Actually, children who are neglected will have imaginary friends. I don't think it's the norm. And so it's interesting, I mean, because I was only talking with somebody recently about the Star Wars movie and how people, particularly my generation, I'm in my mid to late 40s, of course, I mean, I watched the first film when I was 9 years old, when I was in 1977, and people my generation, some people, not everyone, but a lot of people were obsessed with that movie. But I never was. I never bothered watching the second one, not until like 4 years after it had been out in the cinema. And often children will replace fantasy if there's if there's nothing in their personal life actually giving that. If the father figure isn't there, then the child makes up an imaginary father. And I just wonder to what degree Bing Bong, in a sense, is to some degree perhaps the father figure. But that's just a thought, and it's not something I particularly thought out particularly well. But just because I know that childhood imaginary friends are not the norm for every child.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how much, like he's definitely the only male adultish energy in there. I mean, there's the other sort of kind of side characters that are basically working the long storage memory, but they don't really play much of a role. And I can see where you're coming from with that. I think that I'm not sure I remember exactly how much was talked about Dad's influence over Riley's early childhood. It does seem like it's a very sort of traditional household, in that Mom stays home and then Dad goes to work. And if maybe Dad was away for too long, or like most of the time, then there would be a sort of hunger within Riley to have a dad around, and maybe it took the shape of Bing Bong.
There does seem to be some issue for Riley, because like when he has to disappear off to work, the argument, those seem to infer that there's some lack of connection between them. So I think you could argue that there is some lack of connection there. That's arguably true of the mother as well. I mean, the mother is no more or less connected to her daughter than the father is, but I'm just thinking about some of those particular poignant moments which involve the father.
You could say that Mom and Riley had more communication than Dad and Riley did. Like, Dad and Riley's communication, pretty much the primary communication was, there's some playing and some, hockey and all that stuff.
Yeah.
But then there was also like two main interactions is the fight, and then the moment where she just doesn't want to engage goofiness and that he leaves, right? Whereas with Mom, there's actually a bit of a sort of deeper understanding of the situation and discussion of the situation. Not very deep, but deeper. It seems to me like the mom is the primary caregiver in this family, and the dad is just sort of going and working for the money, right?
Yeah, interesting. So, was there anything more you wanted to add that struck you about it that we haven't perhaps touched on?
No, I think we've hit everything over the head. I look forward to hearing what people think about this, and maybe any theories that we missed, any ideas that we didn't share. It's a delicious movie, absolutely worth watching. One of my favorite movies, I think, and so definitely watch it and show it to your kids and psychoanalyze the hell out of it.
I think it's definitely ones to watch with the children, and actually ones to have a discussion with the children afterwards. See how they feel about it, what they think about it.
Yeah.
And how it relates to their real lives, It'd be fascinating to hear what children said. I did actually poll a very small poll about it. It did seem that children under the age of 7 really enjoyed it, and children above that age seemed fairly not so interested in it. Take that for what it means, I don't know, but it was interesting.
I think that if there was any message to take away from this movie, it would be twofold. A, communicating about the difficult things and the sad things in life is very important for a family system to stay cohesive, and for people to not get erratic and hostile or do things that are problematic for everybody involved, right, or very risky, right? And the other one is to really recognize the value of sadness and grief, right? That the lack of grief, the lack of sadness is one of the major, if not the major, sort of source of dysfunction in the family and in the personal sort of individual experience of a person, right? Like, if you do anything that you have real frustrations with, chances are there's some grieving that you haven't done, and that will sort of restabilize your system.
Right.
I think that's a very excellent message to have out there in the mainstream.
Yeah, and I think it actually, it's not just talking about sadness, but even just talking more rationally about the emotions of anger and fear. If someone's angry, there's a reason for why they're angry. Now, of course, the reason might not be you, it might not be whatever, but I think when it comes to a parent-child relationship, I think it's primarily likely to be something you're missing.
Yeah, you probably could have done this, told the same story with any other emotion. it would have been somewhat different. But if Joy was afraid of fear, then Riley would have been like super high risk taking and maybe sort of gotten hurt or something, right? Like you can do this with any of the emotions, right? So the idea is sort of like, hey, they all have some value to offer and they're really worth listening to. And if you don't listen to them, they will get their way one way or another, which is how sadness basically triggered the destabilization of the system by touching the core memories, and everybody freaked out, and then they flew off the handle, right?
Yeah, and ironically, it was actually Joy that caused all the core memories to be lost.
Yeah.
If it hadn't been for her messing around, it probably wouldn't have. They probably wouldn't have gotten into the situation in the first place.
Yeah, sadness would have just grabbed the memory and gotten sad and talked about it, and movie over. That doesn't make for a very good movie. So. Well, listen, thank you, Juan. It's been a great conversation, and hopefully we'll get some feedback from listeners. And yeah, thanks again.
Tell me a secret.